Hello there. They've been burning the US flag in the Iranian parliament. President Trump has made threatening noises about what might happen if Iran resumes its nuclear program. It seems like this is an almighty struggle between Iran and the US. It is that, of course, but there's another way of looking at it. This is the first time Europe and President Trump have set themselves up for a showdown. Trump wants an end to the deal, but does America have the power now over banks and trade to drag the Europeans out of the deal too? Or do the Europeans now have the clout to resist American sanctions and keep the deal intact and keep European companies in business in Iran? Well, Gabriel Gatehouse has been looking at how this clash of strategies could play out.
When Donald Trump announced his intention to pull the United States out of the Paris climate deal last year, the rest of the world said, well, that's a shame, but we're going to carry on anyway. The deal still stands. On Iran, Britain and others are trying a similar tactic.
Britain has no intention of walking away. Instead, we will cooperate with the other parties to ensure that while Iran continues to restrict its nuclear program, then its people will benefit from sanctions relief in accordance with the central bargain of the deal.
But how realistic is that? The US now says it'll reimpose sanctions as well as penalise companies around the world that do business with Tehran.
The business community will weigh their options and weigh their risks, and they'll see that the US market is much larger than the Iranian market and with much less risk, and the choice will be rather obvious. No publicly traded company can choose Iran over the United States. It would be a disastrous decision.
So we can expect international companies to withdraw their business in certain sectors, including oil. The sanctions will likely force countries to reduce their purchase of Iranian oil, hurting the economy further. So what might Tehran's response be? Well, so far the Iranian president has said that the deal remains in place if the goals of the deal remain in place, i.e. that Iran continues to get economic benefit. But it's not likely that the European nations will be able to do much to mitigate the effects of sanctions on Iran. In the Iranian parliament today, hardline MPs burnt a copy of the nuclear agreement. The hands of those who'd like to restart Iran's nuclear program have been strengthened. So what are their options? They could resume uranium enrichment or production of centrifuges. They could limit access for international inspectors. If it looks like Iran is moving back towards a place where it could produce a nuclear weapon, even the European nations and Russia and China will find it hard to stay on board.
Europe has to keep the door open because they are currently the only bridge between Washington and Tehran. Europe and Iran will be playing for time. Time hoping that President Trump might not be re-elected in 2 years.
Meanwhile, Britain finds itself in an unusual position, siding with the European Union, which it's busy leaving, against its staunchest ally and partner in special relationships.
As long as Donald Trump remains president, we must get used to a world without American leadership. A world where efforts to secure peace and progress on the greatest challenges facing the planet must be made, not just without American cooperation, but often in the face of this administration's active opposition.
If this is a test of Europe's clout, then it is in the field of business rather than diplomacy that it'll find itself most challenged. But what if the United States isn't stepping back from global leadership? What if, fresh from playing hardball with North Korea, Trump thinks he might get a better deal by putting the squeeze on Iran?
I think we're seeing a different type of US leadership. It's not multilateral, it's very direct, it's very selfish, if you will. This is about America first. And this is a president that is all about making sure he keeps his campaign promises and demonstrates to the American people that he can be accountable.
Could nevertheless be effective.
Anything can happen.
This is a massive gamble. Best case scenario, a stronger Iran deal is built out of the ruins of the old one. Worst case scenario, Iran starts building the bomb and it's war.
Gabriel Gatehouse there. Interestingly, Europe has in the past clashed with the US on Cuban sanctions. And for example, 11 years ago, an Austrian bank was being taken over by an American company. The Austrian bank dropped some Cuban clients. The bank said its new owner couldn't allow it to keep Cubans as customers. The Austrian government threatened to fine the bank for breaking an EU regulation not to respect US sanctions that it deemed extraterritorial. Well, in that case, the US actually gave a license to the American buyer to keep the Cuban clients, so no Austrian fine was needed. Well, I'm joined now by Bill Burns, former Deputy Secretary of State under President Obama, a key architect of the Iran deal, who went for quiet talks with Iran before the negotiations became public. And very good evening to you, and thanks so much for joining us. The great dilemma for Europe, Ambassador Burns, is do you yield to Trump when you so profoundly disagree with what he's doing, or do you try and keep the deal alive and potentially threaten, an argument with the US about being a sanctions buster for an American policy to keep sanctions up?
Well, I think the risk is obviously that, this could be the biggest rift in relations within the transatlantic alliance since, 2003 and the war in Iraq 15 years ago. I have no doubt but that our European allies, who played such a crucial role in producing the comprehensive nuclear agreement with Iran, will do everything they can to try to persuade the Iranian government to continue to live up to its obligations under the agreement. And our European allies have also gone a long ways toward addressing legitimate concerns that we share about Iranian behavior beyond the nuclear agreement across the Middle East. But I think the dilemma is going to come when the Trump administration follows through in its determination to apply secondary sanctions to discourage European businesses from operating in Iran, trading and investing, which will then produce an atrophy of the kind of economic benefits that the Iranian government looks for as part of the Iranian nuclear agreement. And in that kind of circumstance, I think it becomes very, very difficult to sustain the agreement. So while I admire the effort that our European allies are obviously continuing to make, I think it's going to be very, very hard to hold the agreement together in the face of that kind of economic pressure from the US.
If Airbus wants to sell planes to the Iranians and Airbus is told you'll be sanctioned by the United States if you do, effectively Europe just has to give in and yield to what President Trump wants.
Well, it's a pretty stark choice.
Yeah.
Or European governments, engage in what in effect would be a kind of trade war with the U.S. in which they're only losers, I think. Yeah. So I don't doubt that the determination of our European allies to try to preserve the agreement, but I think it's going to be very hard.
So basically, you're very pessimistic that the Europeans can hold the agreement together, and thus pessimistic for for it carrying on.
Yeah, I'm afraid, I don't mean this as a sort of American-centric view of this, but I think the American role was essential in helping to produce this agreement. And I think, as we pull out of the agreement, it's going to be very difficult to hold it together. And I think that's deeply foolish.
How does that make you feel personally? I know you invested a lot of your diplomatic career to making this thing come alive, this agreement, and watching it, die in 24 hours from your country's president. What does that make you feel as a career diplomat?
Well, it's personally very disappointing, as it is for the dozens and dozens of other people from a lot of other countries who worked very hard to help produce this agreement. But, much more important than that personal disappointment is the broader disappointment in a situation where here, for once, hard-nosed diplomacy produced an outcome, preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, produced a coalition of countries that worked very hard together to achieve that. And at a moment when diplomacy ought to matter more than ever on the international landscape, we're rapidly eroding it. And the United States, I'm afraid, is hemorrhaging trust right now. After pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, and now the Iran nuclear agreement, we're squandering what ought to be one of the biggest assets of the United States, our alliances, our ability to mobilize coalitions of countries, what sets us apart from lonelier powers like Russia and China. And as I said, I'm afraid we're rapidly squandering that advantage.
I think we should point out that a lot on the Trump side would say actually it's working, the Trump style. Today, 3 American prisoners in Korea released. They say that, the tough talk, the slightly bombastic style that we're all getting used to seems to deliver results. I don't know whether do you put credence in that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a very welcome step that the Trump administration has produced the return of 3 Americans, unfairly detained in North Korea. That's a welcome step. I hope very much that the president's upcoming summit meeting with Kim Jong-un is also a success, although I think there's a pretty wide gap in what the two sides define as denuclearization right now. But I think that exercise in diplomacy is important. But what we're seeing on the Iranian nuclear agreement is not just bombast or rhetoric. It's the physical act of withdrawing from the agreement, which I think is unfortunately going to produce a fatal blow to what was a real diplomatic achievement, which we share with our European allies.
Ambassador Burns, thanks very much for talking to us tonight. Thank you.